Hey, and welcome to today's video where we are going to continue with our second video in our series of being a biblical wife and what is your role of a biblical wife. So I'm super excited to dive into today's video. Now, if you haven't seen my previous video yet, then first of all, I will put the link to the entire playlist up here, but I will also put the link to that particular first video in the description below, which is about being a keeper of the home. Now today, what I wanted to share with you is what is another role of a biblical wife, and that is to be your husband's helper. Now that is an interesting topic, so let's dive into that right now. Now before we start, I wanted to add a little bit of a disclaimer here, and that is that when I talk about a husband and a wife, and when I talk about marriage, I obviously talk from the perspective of me as a wife. So I'm not talking about the husband in this case. And of course, he has a lot of different roles as well. And that is also in the Bible. So that is very important too. And I also wanted to mention that I'm talking about a healthy relationship. I'm not talking about when your husband is abusive or anything else. That is not what I wanted to talk about. So all these tips and things that I mentioned are when you are in a healthy relationship. If you're not in a healthy relationship, I would definitely seek counseling and go to your pastor and talk about it. But these tips and all the things I'm talking about is for those that have a healthy relationship. So anyway, without further ado, let's dive into today's video. Now, first off, for those that do not know me yet, my name is Stephanie. I'm a mom to 3 kids, and I am a full-time homemaker, homeschooling mom, and I love everything about it. And one of the things that I really love to do is to encourage other women to step into that God-given role of being a homemaker and being the one that takes care of the house. And so that is what you'll find on my channel. And what we're doing right now is a super fun series about the roles of a biblical wife. So let's dive into being your husband's helper. Now, the term of being your husband's helper actually always raises some questions, and it actually sometimes even raises some backlash and people that really don't want to hear about it, because it often feels like being a helper is less than anything else, basically. But today we're going to talk about what the difference is between being your husband's helper and the type of helper that a lot of times comes into your mind, where you're just basically like a slave and you're just helping someone, but you're not that important. Because that is what often comes up with a lot of women when they hear being your husband's helper. They immediately feel like they are less, they are not worth as much as their husband, they are not important enough, their husband is the most important part of the family, and you are just here to serve your husband and to do everything he wants. Well, that is not what it means to be your husband's helper, and we're going to dive into the word and actually see what does God say about being your husband's helper. So let's dive into the Bible first and read the verse that basically sparked this entire idea of being your husband's helper, because God talks about us women being the helper of your husband in Genesis. So let's read that verse together. In Genesis 2, verse 18, he says, "The Lord God said, 'It is not good for the man to be alone. I will make him a helper suitable for him.'" So in the Bible, it literally says that God created a helper, and then it continues on to talk about how he created a woman. Now, that often feels like, okay, he created the most important part first, and then he thought, you know what, he shouldn't be alone. Let's create him a helper. Let's create him a slave or somebody that's going to serve him. That is not what it says. Now, the most important part of this verse is the word helper, obviously. And the interesting thing is the word helper in Hebrew that is used in this verse is the word ezer. I think it's pronounced ezer, E-Z-E-R. And that word is actually very important because that word means helper. But that word is used in the Old Testament 21 times, and it's used way more often in the New Testament as well. But in the Old Testament, it is used 21 times. 16 out of those 21 times is when God refers to himself as being a helper to the Jewish people, so to the people of God. Now that is very interesting to me because I do not ever think of God as being a servant or being unimportant or not important enough. The Jewish people were everything and he was just there to serve them. That is not what we think about when we see that God was their helper. We see it as God was always there to provide for them and to help them in their situation. So being a helper doesn't mean that it's a bad thing. Being a helper is actually a very important role, and God even calls himself a helper 16 times in the Old Testament alone. So in the New Testament, there's a lot more references to being a helper, and the word Ezer is being used a lot more times in the New Testament. But I think that is just one of those things that is really interesting to me, that we see the word helper as women and we feel bad. But when we see the word helper being used as God being our helper, we love it. And we're so thankful that he is the one that helps us, and that he's always there for us, and that he is there to basically help us through our life. So that is interesting, first off. Now, one of the things that I wanted to mention as well is something that I heard recently, and it made me kind of laugh, because being your husband's helper basically just means one thing: your husband needs help. And I never thought of it that way, but that is so true. You are your husband's helper because he needs you. Husbands need you to be their helper. And that is because we have a lot of different roles as women, which again, we are going to talk about all those different roles that we have as a woman. But the number one thing is, you were created as his helper because he needed you. God even said it in his word, because he said in that same verse that we just read, it is not good for the man to be alone. So he was alone, and he saw that the husband, but he wasn't the husband yet, but that the man was not happy being alone. It was not good for him. God said, it is not good for him. I will make him a helper. So your husband needs you, and that is something that is very important to learn. Yes, you might do some things that feel unimportant, but your husband needs you. You two are two that became one when you got married. So you two are part of the same covenant. You belong together and you need each other. And same way that he needs you, you need him. You are complementary to each other. But it is important to remember that you're not less than your husband. You're just different. You're very different. Men and women don't look alike. And that is with a reason, because God saw what he made and he saw that it was good, but he saw that it was not good for him to be alone, and that he needed somebody else that had a lot of different qualities that were also really good, because that is what he even says in his word when he created a woman. He saw that those two beautiful, good things together would be amazing. Now, that is one of the things that I wanted to mention, because it is very important that we realize that we as women have completely different roles, and we are just completely different. Everything about a woman is so different than a man, and that there's nothing wrong with that. We are just made in a different, with different purposes than a man. And the basic typical stereotype roles are the man is the one that hunts and the woman is the one that cooks, things like that. But that is so important. If you don't have a husband that hunts for you, you cannot cook, right? Because if you don't have your husband, then you don't have a job. You don't have anything to do in the house. But the same, it goes both ways, because he can hunt all the time and he can hunt whatever he wants. But if he hunts all the time and nobody cooks his food for him, how is he going to eat all that food? He can have a lot of animals, but if you don't cook them, he can't eat it. So we need each other, and that is not only in hunting. I mean, that was, for some reason, the first example that came up in my mind, but it is with all the things in life, we need each other. Now, being your husband's helper can look in many different ways, but it all comes down, like I said before, it all comes down to your roles as a wife. And as a wife, you are the keeper of the home. You are the one that provides for the food and the clothing. You are the gatekeeper of your house. You are the one that cooks dinner. You create a clean and safe place in the house. You are the one that he can talk to, because a lot of times a man can look at things more objectively, and sometimes they need that emotional part that we as women can bring into the conversation that will actually help them to see things in a different way. So it is very important to realize that your role is actually super important, and God did not create a husband and a wife without a purpose. He created a man and a woman, they get married, and they are one flesh, they become one flesh, and it actually says that let me see, in yes, verse 24, it actually says it in that same chapter in verse 24, for this reason, so the things that they mentioned above, a man will leave his father and his mother, he will be united with his wife, and they will become one flesh. So when you two became married, you became two individuals turned into one flesh, and it's something that God created so beautifully. And what I really want you to take away from this video is that being your husband helper doesn't mean you are less than your husband, because that is not true. That is not what God meant when he said that you are your husband's helper. He said you are very important to him because he needs you. The same way as the Jewish people needed God to help them. It wasn't because God was less than them and they were high and they needed a servant. No, they were created by God. They were his people, but they needed him to help them. And that is why God refers to himself as a helper, and he refers to a woman as a helper in the same way. A husband needs you. The Jewish people needed God and still do. But it's really important that you get that picture in your mind. I am a helper, and I can compliment them, and I can show things to my husband that he might not even notice, or things that he might not even think about, because you were created very differently. So I hope that that is something that you take away from this video. And next time, I really want to talk about submission, because that is something that often gets confused when we talk about being a husband's helper and being submissive to your husband. What does that mean? And does that mean, again, that you are just his servant and you need to do whatever he says you need to do? No, it doesn't. Let me say that already. But I want to talk more about submission, because that is something that really has a lot to do with being your husband's helper. Now, I really hope that this encouraged you and that this video was helpful to you. And I really love to see you in all my videos about the biblical wife. So feel free to subscribe, and I hope to see you in my next video.